senior boy landed beside me, and he said, "What do you think this is, the end of the world?" I said, "No, I reckon that's bloody how the hell he's going up."
I'm just a step off the local hospital. Investigating the
For New Zealand, as for the world, the 1920s were years of change. The motor car and the aeroplane were bringing a new speed and mobility to our way of life. In Hawke's Bay, as everywhere else, the streets were busy with traffic, and building boom was changing the appearance of the towns. In 1930, Hastings had a population of 10,000 and was the business and service centre for the developing orchards and market gardens of the Heretaunga Plains, as well as the more distant sheep farming areas. Among its largest buildings were the Grand Hotel, the post office, and Roach's department store. Napier, with a population of 16,000, was the port and administrative centre for Hawke's Bay. It had some fine buildings too, like the Masonic Hotel, the Municipal Theatre, and St John's Cathedral, already 40 years old. The boys' high school and its hostel had moved down to a new site at Te Awa in 1926, and soon after an impressive assembly hall was built. At the Napier Hospital, a new nurses' home was opened in 1930. St Paul's Presbyterian Church had burnt down in 1929, and a new brick building was almost ready to be opened. Hastings Street was the busiest street in the town, on the main tram route over Shakespeare Road to the port. Dr. Moore's private hospital overlooked the Marine Parade, the scene of the annual Mardi Gras. It was held as usual in January 1931. Was the inner harbour, a sheltered idle lagoon which provided a perfect area for picnicking and yachting. This photograph was taken at the Sailing Club jetty on a Sunday late in January 1931, at the end of a perfect afternoon. But while the people of Hawke's Bay were enjoying those hot summer days, two great masses of Earth's crust beneath them were moving. For many decades, the edges had been locked, but the friction which held them together could no longer withstand the great stresses. Soon they must tear themselves apart. The 3rd of February was the first day back at school for the year. In town, people were about their business. Then, at almost 13 minutes to 11, with no warning, the ground heaved upwards, swaying violently. A pause. Then more movement. This time downwards and sideways. 2.5 minutes passed before the earth was finally still. When the roar of destruction ceased, blinding white dust obscured people's view for a little time. As it cleared, those who were not injured or trapped by the falling buildings saw their familiar surroundings changed forever.
It was my first day at high school. After assembly in the hall, the new boys went straight to the classrooms to sit tests. The senior boys went out to the playing fields to begin a week of military drill. In the class, we felt a slight tremor, and one boy said, "Earthquake, sir." Then the real shake came. Matt Alexander, the teacher, said, "Everybody out," and held the door open. I fell over in the doorway and everybody trampled over me. Then I got to my knees and I saw the assembly hall come down like a pack of cards. Each wall collapsed in turn, then the roof fell in. There was a momentary lull, and then I ran across the quad, but the second shake sent me to the ground again. A senior boy landed beside me, and he said, "What do you think this is, the end of the world?" I said, "No, I reckon it's that bloody Narahali blowing up."
I was a sister at the Napier hospital and was to begin my annual leave on February the 3rd. I was ironing my clothes before packing. Without warning, there was a terrific jolt. I was thrown to the floor, and through the door I could see the passage wall curving over like a wave. Bricks and match lining fell upon me. I couldn't move, and I couldn't see because of the dust from the bricks and mortar. When the second shake came, everything sank further into the room below. The tie roof opened above me, and I was able to climb out. A nurse who was clinging to her bed in the next room joined me, and together we walked off the roof, which sloped down to the roadway. I saw a nurse crouched on a ledge, so I climbed up to her. She'd been having morning tea with 3 other nurses in a bedroom, and had been thrown out of the window. Her hand was trapped between a mattress and a large piece of masonry. I couldn't release her, but 2 men appeared with a crowbar and managed to free her hand. The 3 other nurses were all killed.
Hastings had suffered too. Roach's store had collapsed completely, and 17 people had died. The Grand Hotel, the library, and the post office were in ruins. Because water was available, the fires which broke out could be contained, although some burnt into the night. But in Napier, fanned by a breeze from the sea, and with the water supply almost non-existent, the fires could not be checked as they moved through the town. By early afternoon, Aturiri and the centre of Napier were ablaze. As fires burned, men dug frantically to rescue survivors trapped in the wreckage, but were often forced to retreat from the advancing flames. HMS Veronica was moored at West Quay and was able to send the first news of the disaster to the rest of New Zealand. The sailors were soon ashore, helping with the rescue work. In Auckland, HMS Dunedin and Diomede were soon loading equipment and medical supplies. With a team of doctors and nurses, they set sail at 3 o'clock that afternoon. At 8:30 next morning, they steamed into Hawke Bay at full speed. Soon, more sailors were at work. Their help during those days will not be forgotten in Napier. Damage to the wards at the Napier Hospital made it difficult to treat the casualties. Beds were moved into the streets and the botanical gardens until an emergency hospital was set up at the Napier Racecourse, now Anderson Park. Where possible, patients were evacuated south to other centres where better care could be provided. The dead were buried at Park Island Cemetery. 101 bodies lie in this communal grave, 14 of them unidentified. Security in both towns was maintained by patrols of volunteers, but there was no lawlessness or looting. But accommodation was a problem. The frequent earthquakes felt over the following days and weeks made people nervous of remaining indoors. Often their homes were in a chaotic condition. Most camped outside in the warm summer weather. These people are heading for the Marine Parade Beach, where many camped. Others set up house in their gardens or in the streets. Any grassy area was likely to be dotted with tents. At Nelson Park, army tents provided homes for hundreds. Food depots were set up to provide meals, for there was no running water, no electricity, and no sewerage, although some people managed to improvise at home. Large numbers left town altogether. When the fires had burnt out, the immediate problems of death and injury had been dealt with, and the necessities of life reorganized, the people of Hawke's Bay took stock of their situation. 258 lives had been lost, and there were countless injuries. In Wairoa, several buildings were destroyed and the bridge was down. Buildings were severely damaged at Waipukurau, Waipawa, at Tiati College, and the mission at Green Meadows. At the Park Island Old Men's Home, 90-year-old James Collins was buried for 3 days. Transport was disrupted, especially to the north of Napier. Slips had blocked the roads, the railway had been damaged, and bridges were down. In Hastings, some well-known landmarks had gone. Damage was widespread, and pockets of fire dotted the town. In Havelock North, the bridge had collapsed, and some buildings were unusable. But it was Napier that had suffered most. Only a few homes were destroyed, but hardly a building in the centre of town still stood undamaged. Of those that did, most, like St. Paul's Church, were gutted by fire. The cathedral was reduced to rubble. The Municipia was a hollow ruin. The town had virtually ceased to exist. But any doubts about the future of the two towns were soon cast aside as the task of cleaning up and rebuilding began. Even before the streets had been cleared of debris, the Napier banks had combined to erect adjoint premises. The Napier Citizens Control Committee ruled that a temporary shopping area would be built in Clive and Memorial Squares. It was soon known as Tin Town. It was the forerunner of today's suburban shopping centres, and soon became Napier's social focus. No permanent buildings were permitted until decisions had been made about the future of the town. It was decided to widen the narrow streets, an opportunity unlikely to be repeated, and for the first time in New Zealand to bury all power lines. The trams were never to run again. The first building to go up was the Market Reserve Building, planned by the Borough Council before the quake. A riveted frame was specified rather than a welded one. The racket of the riveters was thought to be good therapy for Napier. More noise was being made by the machinery being used to clear the debris, the blasting of demolition gangs, and a procession of trucks carrying the rubble to Hyderabad Road and to the Marine Parade. Some buildings came down. Others had their surviving portions strengthened and refurbished, and new buildings arose. With the view of Napier changing each week, the rebirth was a reality. Hastings had its temporary shops too, but soon buildings were repaired and some fine new ones completed. And all over Hawke's Bay, hundreds of chimneys were being rebuilt. By the end of 1932, both towns were in a mood to celebrate. Hastings held a carnival in November, and a procession wound through the town. The new Napier Carnival was held in January 1933. Many events were organised, culminating in a parade led by Miss Sheila Williams, the Carnival Queen. About this time, a memorial to the victims was unveiled at the community grave at Park Island. Now there was an urge to embellish the new towns. In Hastings, the bells from the old post office were housed in a new clock tower. Extensive landscaping in Windsor and Cornwall parks created popular recreation areas. In Napier, the development of the Marine Parade had begun before the quake, with the building of this playground and laying of lawns. Now, more gardens were laid out, and the skating rink and colonnade built, with the bell from the Veronica taking pride of place. The Napier 30,000 Club worked to add more attractions, including the Sound Shell, and the memorial arches. The Tom Parker Fountain, and the TNG clock were built in 1936. The road south was widened. By the end of the decade, the Marine Parade looked very much as we know it today, and was a popular feature for both local people and tourists. But perhaps the most striking change in Napier, and the one which was to have the greatest effect on its future, was the uplifting of the inner harbour. The water had begun to drain away immediately after the quake. Within a few days, most of the seabed was exposed, and the swampy southern end was high and dry. The problem of stranded fish had to be dealt with quickly to avoid disease. Boats had to be rescued, because the sailing club was now far from any water. Except for 9 small islands which remained in Māori ownership, the land became the property of the Hawke's Bay Harbour Board, which began immediately to plan for its development. Trenches were dug to drain the salt from the soil, and an outfall channel created to carry runoff from the hills. By 1936, land was being ploughed for crops, and sheep and cattle were grazing. In 1944, part of the land became the Hawke's Bay Airport, conveniently close to town. The areas to the southwest became Napier's new industrial and residential suburbs. The growth of Hawke's Bay has outstripped the imagination of those who had the faith over 50 years ago to rebuild. Hastings has thrived on the produce of the Heretaga plains which surround it. Havelock North, though still affectionately called the village by those who live there, is now a busy town. Napier has spread over what was once swampland to join with Taradale, and is no longer hemmed in between sea and harbour. Barely a trace remains of the destruction wrought by the quake, but many valuable lessons were learned in 1931. Our buildings today are safer because of them. We will continue to have earthquakes, yet we know better now how to cope with their destruction and how to survive.